Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph and we will be learning today Mitzvah Hashem Taf Lamed Vav Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Tefillin. We pick up today on the very bottom line of the Shulchan Aruch on Lamed Hey Amid Beis with a brand new Siman Chav Vav. Din mi 1 second. Yes. Din mi she'ein lo elo tefillah achas. The halachah that pertains to somebody who finds himself in a situation where he only has one of the tefillin, either the shal yad or the shal rosh, u'bay beis se'ifim, and here we have two se'ifim. Says the Mechaber, im ein lo yelo tefillah achas, if somebody only has one of the tefillin, maniach oisa sheyesh lo, he should put on the one that he has, u'mevarech aleha, and he should make a bracha on it. Shekal achas mitzvah b'ftei atzma, because each one of them, the shal yad and the shal rosh, represents its own mitzvah. There's a mitzvah to put on the shal yad, ukishartem la'os al yodecha. There's a mitzvah to put on the shal rosh, v'hayu l'tei tafais bein einecha. But each one of them is its own kiyam hamitzvah, and therefore they're not ma'akiv one another. If you only have one, you should put on that one and make a bracha on that one. Continues the Mechaber on Lamed Vav Amid Aleph. V'huadin im yesh lo shteihem. The same halacha would apply if somebody finds himself in a situation where he does have both tefillin, he has the shal yad and the shal rosh, but v'yesh lo shum oines, but there's some kind of an oines situation, she'ena yachal lo hiniach ela achas, where for some reason he's only able to put on one of them. So the first case was he only had one. Now we have a case where he has both, but there is an oinus that is preventing him from putting on one of them. Maniach oisa sheyachal, he should put on the one that he is able to. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Aleph shum oinus. Kigain, what would be the example of an oinus that prevents somebody from putting on one of the tefillin? Says the Chafetz Chaim, Kigain sheyesh lo maka b'roshoi. Let's say somebody has some kind of an affliction on his head, or on his arm. So let's say somebody has some type of a skin affliction, maybe an inflammation or something, where it is very, very, very painful for him to put on his tefillin, and we'll discuss this in greater detail, I believe, further along in Siman Chav Zayin. But there are different types of maladies which would prevent somebody from being able to put on the tefillin. Or the Chafetz Chaim gives another case. Let's say somebody has to go out on a trip, and the caravan that he's going on is not going to wait for him, and he doesn't have time to put on both. He should put on the one that he is able to. And we're going to get to the end of Ois Katan Aleph, right away. This sounds very strange. Person has to go on a trip, and because of that, he's not going to be mekayim the mitzvah of tefillin properly. He's only going to put on one of the tefillin. Doesn't sound right. So the Chafetz Chaim is going to address the question that's coming up in your mind right now. But first, the Chafetz Chaim segues a little bit, and he says like this: if you find yourself in a situation where you have both the shal yad and the shal rosh, and now you have to choose which one to put on. You only have a couple of minutes to quickly put on one of them. Which one should you put on, the shal yad or the shal rosh? So the Chafetz Chaim brings down over here a machlokes. He says, Yesh Oimrim, he brings down from the Yeshuas Yaakov, the Yoser Tov Sheyaniach Shal Rosh Lavad, it would be better that you should only put on the shal rosh. Why? The Kedushasai Chamura, because the shal rosh has more Kedusha than the shal yad. Why is that? So if you take a look in Dirshu footnote number 3, he brings down over here, why is it that we say that the Kedusha of the shal rosh is greater than the Kedusha of the shal yad? Kasav Shulchan Aruch Lakaban, the Shulchan Aruch writes a little bit further in Siman Membeis, Sheruba Shal Shem Shakai Nimtza B'Shal Rosh. We have 2 out of the 3 letters of the name of Hashem, the Shem Shakai, Shin Dalad Yud. We have 2 of those letters on the Shal Rosh. Where do we have 2? We have the Shin that is imprinted on the bias of the Shal Rosh, and then there's the Dalid, which is made on the Kesher of the Shal Rosh. Ubira Mishnah Berurah Sham, the Mishnah Berurah explains over there in Siman Membeis, Shabal Sharosh Nimtzai Sa'oisi Shin V'Dalet. We have the shin and the dalet, the shin on the bayis, the dalet on the kesher. V'ilu b'shal yad, while on the shal yad, yesh rak kesher shal yud. All we have is the yud of the kesher on the shal yad, so there's more kedusha to the shal rosh than there is to the shal yad. So that's what the Yeshua Yaakov says. V'yesh oimrim, then the Chavetz Chaim brings down over here from the Artzas HaChaim, there are those that say that right now you have to choose between the shal yad and the shal rosh. You should put on the shal yad. Why? A very obvious reason. Because why do we always put on the shal yad first? Because it says, so the Torah Dirshu always places the shal yad first. And incidentally, that's also where we know the halachah that whenever the shal rosh is on, the shal yad is supposed to be on. Because first you put on the shal yad, and then while the shal yad is on, you put on the shal rosh. So the Artzas HaChaim says, don't change the order of business. If you only could put on one, put on the shal yad. Now, the Chavetz Chaim concludes Ais Katan Aleph, and he says, Bamed Dvarim Amurim, when could we even begin to have this conversation where we're saying that because of an oinus that you have to travel, you're not going to put on both the shal yad and the shal rosh? Says the Chavetz Chaim, that's only kishiyeh yochal achakach la'anyach baderech hatfila hashniya. That's only when, at some point while you're traveling, you're going to be able to put on the other one, and you're going to be mekayim the mitzvah in the proper manner. But if you're waiting for the bus, and now the bus came, so you only want to put on your shal yad, and you're not going to put on the shal rosh at all today, then the Mishnah Berurah says nothing doing. Yaniach ha-shal yad, put on the shal yad, v'ha-shal rosh, and the shal rosh, kaidam alichasai mi-beisai, before you leave your house. Because we're on account of having to delay your trip, you don't get a heter to be mevatel the mitzvah say daraisa of tefillin on account of a delay of your travel plans. You have a chiyuv daraisa to put on tefillin. You have to put on the shal yad and the shal rosh. The fact that you're going to be late somewhere doesn't enter into the equation. Okay, now we go to the second line of the Shulchan Aruch, Sif Beis. Says the Mechaber, so we just established that there are times when you may put on one, either the shal yad or the shal rosh, without the other. Now, what do you do with the brachas? Now, let's just remember, we have the Shitas HaMechaber, who holds that in a normal situation, you only make one bracha on tefillin. You make a sheker d'shanu b'mitzvaysav etzivanu l'haniach tefillin. You put on the shal yad, and then right away you put on the shal rosh, and that's the only bracha that you make. And the l'haniach covers the shal yad and the shal rosh. Now, according to the Mechaber, what happens if you put on the shal yad, and then before you could put on the shal rosh, you're mafsik? Some hefsik comes up. You speak to somebody. Now you are mafsik. Then the Mechaber says, since you are mafsik, now the Lohaniach cannot go on the Shal Rosh. So now you have to make a bracha on the Shal Rosh. If you have to make a bracha on the Shal Rosh, what bracha do you make? So in a normal situation, says the Mechaber, you only make a Lohaniach. If you are mafsik between the Shal Yad and the Shal Rosh, then you make it al mitzvahs on the Shal Rosh. According to the Ramah, you always make two brachas on tefillin. You make a Lohaniach before you put on the Shal Yad, and the Lohaniach covers both the Shal Yad and the Shal Rosh. And then we have a very interesting thing. When we come to put on the Shal Rosh, which is the Gemar HaMitzvah, we complete the mitzvah of putting on tefillin. When we put on the Shal Rosh, Tosfos says that Chazal will masaket a second bracha on the Gemar HaMitzvah. There's a bracha of al mitzvah tefillin that we make before we put on the Shal Rosh. But even according to the Ramah, the Lohaniach does also go on the Shal Rosh. So you make a Lohaniach that goes on the Shal Yad and the Shal Rosh. Then you make this second bracha of al mitzvah tefillin that covers the Gemar HaMitzvah, the completion of the mitzvah. Now we have a discussion over here. What do we do in the case where you're going to put on one of the tefillin and not the other? Says the Mechaber over here in Sif Beis, in Einay Meniach El Shal Rosh Levad. if you're only going to put on the shel rosh, what bracha do you make? Says the Mechaber, Mevarich aleha al mitzvahs tefillin levad. Even though the Mechaber says that in a normal situation, you only make a bracha of lahaniach, and the bracha of lahaniach goes both on the shel yad and the shel rosh, but the Mechaber also has told us that when you are mafsik between the shel yad and the shel rosh, so now you find yourself in a situation where you have to make a bracha on the shel rosh. In that situation, the bracha on the shel rosh is al mitzvahs. So now in this situation, we are only going to be putting on one of the tefillin. You're only going to be putting on the shel rosh. Says the Mechaber, what bracha do you make? You make a bracha of al mitzvahs. That's the shita of the Mechaber. Now let's see the Ramah, last word, second line, Haga. Ola didan, according to our minig, the nayagim levarich b'chol yom shtei brachos, we always make a lahaniach and an al mitzvahs. So now, what do you do if you're only putting on the shel rosh? See, the Mechaber says, okay, you're only putting on the shel rosh, only make it al mitzvahs. We always make two brachas. So if I'm only putting on the shel rosh, what do I do now? Says the Ramah, mevarich al shel rosh levad shtei brachas. Says the Ramah, according to us, you're going to make two brachas on the shel rosh, because we always have two brachas on the shel rosh. We make a lahaniach that goes on the shel yad and the shel rosh, and we also make al mitzvahs. So today you're only putting on the shel rosh. So okay, you're not making a lahaniach before you put on the shel yad because you're not putting on a shel yad, but you still need to make a lahaniach on the shel rosh. So you make a lahaniach. You also make an al mitzvahs, like we do every day. So again, according to the Mechaber, you usually only make one bracha. You usually only make a lahaniach. You're only putting on a shel rosh. You also make one bracha. You make the bracha of al mitzvahs. But according to the Ramah, we always make a bracha of lahaniach that covers the shel yad and the shel rosh, and we also make a bracha of al mitzvahs. So today you're only putting on a shel rosh. You make both the lahaniach and the al mitzvahs on the shel rosh. Now finally concludes the Ramah, v'im meniach shel yad levad. Now let's say you're only putting on a shel yad. Now this is a very interesting case according to our minig. According to our minig, we make a lahaniach, then we put on the shel yad, then we make an al mitzvahs and we put on the shel rosh. But today I'm only putting on the shel yad. So of course I'm going to make a lahaniach. But do I make it al mitzvahs? We said that the reason we make it al mitzvahs when we put on the shel rosh is because of shitas taisvis in menachos that Chazal were misakin a bracha on the gemar ha-mitzvah. What's the gemar ha-mitzvah of the mitzvah of tefillin? Putting on the shel rosh. But today you're not putting on a shel rosh. So technically speaking, you don't have that gemar ha-mitzvah. So do you make it al mitzvahs today? Says the Ramah, no. You make a lahaniach, you put on the shel yad, and then that's it. You don't make it al mitzvahs. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah's cut and base. According to our minig that we make every day two brachas, we already explained this in Siman Chavei, the Mishnah Berurah Sif Kat Lamed Aleph Ayin Sham, and I gave you the pertinent details already today. Okay, now we go to Sif Gimel, to Ois Kat Gimel. So the Ramah said, according to our minig, if you're only putting on a shel yad, you make only a lahaniach. That's it. You don't make it al mitzvahs. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ayin b'Pri Begadim, take a look at the Pri Begadim. Shehevi oid paiskim, where the Pri Begadim actually brings down paiskim, the svira lahu who hold, the afal shel yad levad, nami mavar shtei brachas. Pri Begadim brings down shitas that hold that even if you're only putting on the shel yad, you make two brachas. Now, why would that be? It seems that the reason is because there still is a gemar ha-mitzvah. Normally, the normal gemar ha-mitzvah of putting on tefillin is when you complete the entire package. You put on the shel yad and then you put on the shel rosh. So the gemar is putting on the shel rosh. But if all you have is one of them, so then the gemar of your mitzvah today is only putting on that one. So you make it al mitzvah tefillin. That's the completion of your mitzvah tefillin right now. I think that's the understanding of these paiskim. So you have these paiskim that argue on this Ramah and say even if you're only putting on a shel yad, you make two brachas, lahaniach and an al mitzvahs. However, says the Chavetz Chaim, the halachah iskimu ha'achronim. However, the achronim conclude halacha l'maisa de'ena mevarich al shel yad elo lahaniach levad, that we should do as the Ramah said. If you're only putting on the shel yad, you only make a bracha of lahaniach. And the Mishnah Berurah says the balav haki harbe rishonim sfiru dafil al shtei nami ein mevarich ela achas. This concept that we make a second bracha of al mitzvahs tefillin when we put on the shel roish is a big chiddush. It's a chiddush of Taisus and Menachos. This concept of making a bracha on the Gemara mitzvah. When do we ever have such a thing that we make a bracha, that we have a mitzvah that we make two brachas on? It's a very interesting concept. So fine, it's a Shitas Taisus, and there are more paskins like that Taisus, and that's what we do on a daily basis. But over here, where it's an exception to the rule, where you're not doing the entire mitzvah, you're only putting on the shel yad, in that case, we don't make a second bracha. Now says the Mishnah Berurah, let's say you goofed. You put on the shel yad and the shel roish, and you neglected to make a bracha. Maybe it's Isru Chag, and you don't have the minig, or the other way. Maybe you have the minig to put on tefillin on Chalamoid. So all Chalamoid you've been putting on tefillin without a bracha. And now it's Isru Chag, and you take out your tefillin, and you put on your tefillin without making a bracha. So now you're wearing the shel yad, you're wearing the shel roish, and you have not yet made a bracha. Now we know the golden rule is that you're always supposed to make a bracha over la siyasam. You always make the bracha before the kiyam ha-mitzvah. But we also learned that when it comes to the mitzvah of tefillin, it's very interesting. Really, every minute that you're wearing tefillin, and you're going to continue to wear tefillin, is over la siyasam. Because every minute you're being mekayim the mitzvah again. So whenever you make a bracha throughout the day, it's still over la siyasam. So says the Mishnah Berurah, if you find yourself in a situation where you put on both the shel yad and the shel roish, and you did not yet make a bracha, dahadinhu diyavarich kol zman shehin olav adayin, and the halacha is that you could still make a bracha, because every minute that you're wearing the tefillin, in the next minute you're going to be mekayim the mitzvah again, so you could still make the bracha. So now, what should you do? Really, you should make a lahaniach and an al mitzvahs. Says the Mishnah Berurah, im hiktim birkas shel roish tchila. Let's say you made an al mitzvahs, but you didn't make the lahaniach. Va'achakach shel yad, and then you made the bracha of lahaniach. Einoi chayzer umavarech. You do not have to repeat the brachas. In other words, I think the chiddush, so to speak, that the Mishnah Berurah is telling you over here is, really you made the brachas out of order, right? Because the lahaniach is the bracha that we make really over la siyasa before we even begin to be mekayim the mitzvah of tefillin. That's when we make a bracha of lahaniach. Then we make a bracha of al mitzvahs according to Taisus, which is a bracha on the gemar. So the bracha on the gemar, l'chayra, has to come before the bracha on the haschala, but yet that's not what you did. What you did was you made a lahaniach, and you made an al mitzvahs, and then you made a lahaniach. So l'chayra, you flipped it. So you might think, since you flipped the script, you have to repeat the brachas. Says the Chavetz Chaim, no, you do not have to repeat the brachas. I think the reason you don't have to repeat the brachas is because in this case, each bracha was still appropriate. When you made the al mitzvahs, it's appropriate now to make a bracha on the gemar ha-mitzvah, because indeed you are wearing the shel yad and the shel roish. And a minute from now, you will also still be wearing the shel yad and the shel roish. So it's appropriate to make the bracha of al mitzvahs, which is really on the gemar ha-mitzvah. At the same time, it's also appropriate to make the lahaniach, because the next minute you will be munach tefillin. So it's still appropriate to make the bracha of lahaniach. So since each bracha taken at face value is still appropriate, even though you did them out of order, you do not have to repeat them. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. Aval lechatchila, however lechatchila, afilu haniach shel yad v'loy birach. Let's say you put on the shel yad without a bracha, and now you're about to put on the shel roish, and you just realized, whoops, I blew it. I didn't make a bracha of lahaniach on the yad. What should you do? Yevarech alav kaidam anachas shel roish. You should make the lahaniach before you put on the shel roish. So you put on the shel yad. What he's saying is, you put on the shel yad without a bracha. You realized before you put on the shel roish. Now what you should do is you should say lahaniach and al mitzvahs, and put on the Shalrosh. Now the Mishnah Berurah worded this in a very funny way. The way the Mishnah Berurah worded this over here was an aval lechatchila. So he told us two halachas, he told us one halacha, and then he said aval lechatchila. And I'm trying in my mind to figure out the flow of the Mishnah Berurah. I think what the Mishnah Berurah is telling us over here is like this. The first halacha that he told me was, if somebody put on both the shel yad and the shel rosh, and he didn't make a bracha on either one, now he should go ahead. Yeah, so really, he should make a lohaniach and a mitzvahs. But that's not what he did. He realized he put on his tefillin without making a bracha. He made the al mitzvahs first, and then he made the lohaniach. So the Mishnah Berurah said, that's okay. B'di'evet, it's acceptable. Even though you made the al mitzvahs first, b'di'evet, it's acceptable. So now let's take a look at the next halachah of the Mishnah Berurah. The next halachah of the Mishnah Berurah was, somebody put on the shel yad without a bracha, and then before he put on the shel rosh, he realized that he neglected to make the bracha on the shel yad. What should he do now? Well, if we look at that through the perspective of the first halacha told me that sometimes it's okay, at least b'di'evet, to make the al mitzvahs first. If you put on both the shel yad and the shel rosh without a bracha, and then you made the al mitzvahs first and then the lohaniach, it's okay, it's acceptable. You don't have to repeat the brachas. So you see that you could make an al mitzvahs before a lohaniach. So now let's apply that to the second case. The second case, you put on the shel yad without a bracha, and you did not yet put on the shel rosh. You're about to make an al mitzvahs, and you realized, wait a second, I never made a lohaniach. Now what should you do? Well, in the first halacha we saw that sometimes it's okay to make the al mitzvahs first. So maybe I should make only an al mitzvahs now, and not make the lohaniach. What will I do with the lohaniach? I'll make the lohaniach after I put on the shel rosh. Now, why should you do that? Well, I'll tell you one reason why. Because we learned that you're always supposed to be memayit, the hefsek between the shel yad and the shel rosh, as much as possible. So why do I want now to make two brachas between the shel yad and the shel rosh? Why should I make a lohaniach and an al mitzvahs? I'll make only an al mitzvahs, and I'm not going to lose the lohaniach. I'll make the lohaniach after I put on the shel rosh. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, don't take it that far. Even though I told you in the first halacha that if you made the al mitzvahs before the lohaniach, it's okay, that's b'di'evet. But lechatchila, we never want you to do that, because the bracha of lohaniach is supposed to be earlier in the process of being mekayim the mitzvah, where the bracha of al mitzvahs is on the gemar. Okay. Now we go to Siman Chav Zayin. Siman Chav Zayin is going to be some Siman. This is the kind of the nitty gritty of putting on tefillin. Siman Chav Zayin. Mokayim hanachasan, the proper place on the body where the tefillin are supposed to be situated. Va'ofen hanachasan, and the form of putting on tefillin, the proper method of putting on tefillin. Uba yud aleph seifim, and here we have 11 seifim. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph. Mokayim hanachasan, the proper place to put the tefillin. Shel yad, mokayim hanachasan shel yad, the proper place to place the tefillin shel yad. Bizraya smoil is on the left arm. Babasar hatapuach shebe'etzem, on the raised flesh of that's on the bone of the arm. Shebein hakuvadoi ubeis hashechi, that runs between the elbow. The kuvadoi is the elbow, ubeis hashechi, and the armpit. So what did the Mechaber just say? The Mechaber said, where's the proper place to put on tefillin? On the left arm. Okay? Left arm. And we'll talk about a lefty another time. So proper place to put on tefillin, left arm. Where do we do it? So he says, be'etzem shebein hakuvdoi ubeis hashechi, along the bone that runs from the elbow to the armpit. So that's the upper arm, right? You got one bone that runs from the elbow up into the shoulder joint. So it's on that arm. Where on that bone? On the basar hatapuach, on the raised basar, the raised flesh. What's the raised flesh? Well, that's your bicep, right? That's your muscle. So over here, the raised flesh. So that's where you put it. Left arm, upper arm, bone from the elbow to the armpit. Where along that bone? On the basar tapuach, on the raised flesh on the muscle. Okay, let's take a look right away at the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is cutting aleph. Smile, the first thing that Mechaber told me was that the proper place to put the tefillah shel yad is on the left arm. How do we know left arm? Says the Mishnah Berurah, midiksiv yadacha behei, because the spelling of yadcha is very interesting. It is not written yud daled and the chaf with a kamatz. Instead, it's written yud daled chaf hey. It is a hey at the end. Pirush, the explanation of that is yad keha, the weak hand. So the word yadcha is seen by the Gemara in Menachos as a contraction. It's a contraction of the word yad and keha, weak. Dahainu hasmail, which is a reference to the left arm, shehitasha v'keha, which typically in most people is the weaker arm. V'ay Dirshu, and there's another drasha that we have in the Gemara in Menachos, midiksiv ukishartam uchesavtam. The Torah juxtaposes two phrases. Ukishartam, you will tie on the tefillin, uchesavtam, and you will write the mezuzah. Maksiva biyamin, just like the act of writing is done by most people with the right hand. Shekain derech b'nei adam, af kishira biyamin. So too the tying on of the tefillin should be done with the right hand. The keven de kishira biyamin, if the act of tying is going to be performed with the right hand, memela hanocha b'smail, it comes out that where will they be tied onto? The right hand is going to be doing the tying, and it's going to tie the tefillin onto the left hand. Now, if a normal, regular, righty person puts on his tefillin on his right hand, af b'di'eved lo yotza, he's not yotza the mitzvah, not even b'di'eved. Okay. Ice cotton bays, babasar atapuach. You place the tefillin on the raised basar, on the muscle. And that is the area of the arm that the Chazal call the kibayris. That's how they refer to the muscle, to the bicep. They call it the kibayris. V'hu ikuva. And the proper placement on the muscle is li'ikuva. If you do not put it in the right place, you're not yotze the mitzvah. We learn this out in the Gemara from a pasuk. Yeah. Ice cut and gimel hakuvadai, the bone that runs from the elbow to the Beis HaShechi, says the Chavetz Chaim, if you're wondering what kubadai is, hanikra elenbayin. That's the elbow. Okay. Now, ice cotton dalit is going to be a very critical ice cotton, but we have to go a little bit further in the Shulchan Aruch first. So the Shulchan Aruch told me, where do you put the tefillah shel yad? Left arm, upper arm, bone that runs from the elbow to the armpit, to the shoulder joint, and where along that arm, on the basar tapuach, on the raised muscle. Continues the Mechaber, the second line of the Siman, V'yata hatfila ma'at litzad haguf. When you take the bias and you put the bias on the arm, you should slant it, and maybe tomorrow I'll bring a pair of tefillin with me, but we'll get something right now to act as a bias. So you don't put it up like this on top of the arm. You turn it somewhat towards the guf. V'yata tefila ma'at litzad haguf. To turn the bias somewhat towards the body. Be'inyan, in a manner, kishayakayf zroyoy lamata, so that if you turn your arm facing downward, what does that mean? My arm right now, let me move back a little. My arm right now is facing upwards. If I turn my arm downwards, my entire arm turns. So says the Shulchan Aruch, don't position the bias of the shel yad up here, facing directly up. Turn it somewhat towards the body, so that kishayachav zroyoy lamata, so that when you turn your arm facing down, you keneged libai, the bias will be opposite the area of the heart, the chest on the left side. The nimtza, and by doing that, it comes out, mekayim, you fulfill the requirement of the pasuk, where the pasuk says, v'hayu adavarim ha'ela al levavecha, that these words that are in the tefillin, the parshias that are in the tefillin, should be al levavecha, upon your heart. So by positioning the bias, so that when you put your arm down, it's facing towards the heart, that's al levavecha. Says the Ramah, Hagah. Now the Ramah is going to write some critical words here in regard to what the Mechaber wrote the placement of the bias should be. Hagah. V'tzarech lahaniach b'roish ha'etzem hasamach lakuvadoi. Literally, what these words seem to mean, the Mishnah Berurah is going to take a little issue with it. V'tzarech lahaniach b'roish ha'etzem hasamach lakuvadoi. You should position the bias when we talk about the upper arm and we talk about the basar hatapuach. Now, the upper arm, that bone that we're referring to from the elbow to the shoulder, that's a long span. Now, we said on the basar hatapuach. Okay, says the Ramah, tzarich laniach b'roisha etzem, you should put it on the side hasamach lakuvadoi, that is closer to the elbow. So it sounds kind of, if we take the bone, if we take the arm from the elbow up to the shoulder, and we divide it in half, the bias of the tefillin shel yad should be on the lower half, not on the upper half. V'tzarich laniach b'roisha etzem, which side of the bone? Hasamach lakuvadoi, that is closer to the elbow, not the half that's closer to the shoulder. Okay. Right? Turn the page to Lamed Vav Amud Beis, top line. Avaloi b'chatzia etzem shasamach l'shechi, not the upper half of the upper arm, not the half that is closer to the shoulder. Now let's take a look at Mishnah Berurah's Katan Daled. B'roish ha'etzem. The way I translated the words b'roish ha'etzem, I said it means the side of the bone closer to the elbow, not the side of the bone closer to the shoulder. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ein ritzonai loymar roisha etzem mamish. If you translate it that way, it could sound like roish ha'etzem. Roish ha'etzem means the end of the bone. It doesn't mean the first half of the bone. Roish ha'etzem hasamach lakuvadai, those words would seem to mean it's not chatzi ha'etzem hasamach lakuvadai. That would mean the half of the bone closer to the elbow. Roish ha'etzem hasamach lakuvadai sounds like it means the end of the bone that's next to the elbow. Well, that would mean that, you know where you should put the tefillin shel yad? If you translate it that way, it seems to mean that you should put the shel yad over here. Right? Let me get my hand out of the picture. Over there. The end of the bone close to the elbow. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no way. It doesn't mean that. Ein ritzayna loymar roisha etzem mamish doesn't mean the end of the bone. Tahasam adayin namach habasar. Because over there, this is the basar tapuach. Right? You see the bump? You see, I don't have that much of a muscle. I'm not a bodybuilder. But you can see that over here is where it's raised. Is it raised down here? No. Now, what did the Mechaber say? The Mechaber was very clear. The Mechaber said, "Babasar atapuach." It has to be on the raised basar. Now, down here, right next to the elbow, is not raised basar. So we can't mean the end of the bone next to the elbow. Again, says the Mishnah Berurah, "Ein ritzayna loymar roisha etzem mamish." It doesn't mean the end of the bone. The hasam adayin namach habasar, because over there the basar is still flat. It's still low. And until the flesh starts to go up, until the muscle starts to rise, until that point, ein makom tefillin. That's bechalal not a place to put on tefillin. If you put on your tefillin between the elbow and where the beginning of the muscle is, you're not yotzeh. De'ein al zeh shem kibayris. Because we said that Chazal say you have to put the tefillin on the kibayris. That's not called the kibaris. Ella rather, Ritzayna Loimar, what the Ramah wants to say when he uses the word roish ha'etzem, hasamach lakuvadai, it seems that what he means is begoiva habasar shebe'etzem. It doesn't mean vitzarich la'aniach beroish ha'etzem hasamach lakuvadai, on the end of the bone close to the elbow. That's not what it means. It means vitzarich la'aniach beroish, at the height ha'etzem of the bone. That means on the basar ha'tapuach, but samuch lakubadai. There's part that's on the upper half of the upper arm that's closer to the shoulder. No, we want you to go on the basar ha'tapuach, but on the basar ha'tapuach, on the lower half of the upper arm, not on the upper half of the upper arm. Now, I'm going to just tell you that I took a measuring tape. The words that I'm going to use will ring even more if you go through the Biur Halacha, very long Biur Halacha, so I'm not going to do it inside. Biur Halacha, Dibur HaMaschil B'Roish HaEtzem. I took a measuring tape, and I measured my upper arm from the elbow to the shoulder. The entire muscle is on the lower half of the upper arm. None of my muscle is on the upper half. The whole muscle really seems to be on the lower half of the arm. So with that in mind, let's see what the Mishnah Berurah says here. So far what the Mishnah Berurah has said was, don't make a mistake and think Roish ha'etzem hasamach lakubadai means the end of the bone down by the elbow. Because if you put the bias of the shel yad down by the elbow before the muscle begins, you're zicher not yoytze tefillin. That's not the makom of tefillin. Ella rather, said the Mishnah Berurah, Ritzayna Loimar, what the Ramah wants to say is, begoiva habasar, at the height of the basar, shebe'etzem, that's on the bone, but we're on the lower half going down towards the elbow. V'loi ba haRamah bazel l'chadish shum davar. There's no chiddush in the words of the Ramah when he said roish ha'etzem, samach lakuvadai, rak b'mashesiem, the chiddush of the Ramah is that you should not put the tefillin on the upper half of the upper arm going towards the armpit. Or it's what he wants to say is, even if you're a bodybuilder and your muscle is much bigger than mine, and part of the muscle extends to the upper half of the upper arm, you still should not put the tefillin on that part of the muscle. The tefillin should be placed on the part of the muscle that's on the lower half of the upper arm. V'gam dasa mechaber hu kain, and this is not a machlokes to mechaber nor Ramah. The Mishnah Berurah says the mechaber agrees with this. The dafka mechatzi ha'etzem ulamata, the tefillin shel yad must be positioned from the halfway mark, from the elbow to the shoulder, from the halfway mark and down. Kedemuchach b'siv zayin. And when the mechaber said that you have to put it on the basar tapuach, al korchach gamkein, the kavanose b'chatzi etzem ulamata. He means, yes, on the muscle, but on the lower half of the upper arm. V'agra b'biurah hiskim ladina, the gra concludes, halachah l'maisa, the chol makom akibaris kasher l'niach by tefillin. The Gra disagrees with what we just said. The Gra holds that as long as the tefillin are on the muscle, even if it's on the upper half of the upper arm, you're still yotze. V'chein mashma b'prisha. V'al kol panim, however, nevertheless, lamata mimakam akibaris pasal l'kulei alma, but underneath the muscle, from the end of the muscle and down towards the elbow, l'kulei alma, that would be pasal. Al kain, therefore, Nachain liminaya milon yach tefillin gedolim, says the Chavetz Chaim, you should be very careful not to have overly large batim. Ki al pi haroiv matzli b'tefillin gedolim, because generally speaking, says the Chavetz Chaim, when you have large batim, it comes out shesoif haketzitza munachas lamata mimakam hakibaris, that the end of the ketzitza, the bottom of the tefillin, the foundation of the bias, the end of it, if you have a big bias, he says the end of it will extend beyond the muscle, going down towards the elbow, and over there you're not yoitza. Even if only a little bit of the bias extends down there, you're not yoitza. So the only way to make sure that you're yoitza, if you're wearing overly large bottom, is to bring the bias further up the arm so that it extends into the upper half of the upper arm. But we shouldn't be makel to do that lechatchila, because we see that there are many shittas that hold that that's also not a makom tefillin up over the halfway point. If you have no choice, if you only have tefillin gedolim, it is better that the bias should extend to the upper half of the upper arm, where it is still on the muscle. And you'll be yoitz at least according to the Shita Sagra and other poskim. That would be better than allowing the bias to extend further down after the muscle towards the elbow, where you're not yoitz according to anybody. And even the bracha that you make would be a bracha levatala. Okay, we're going to stop over here. Thank you so much for joining me for Limud HaTorah. This list of Limud HaTorah should be made against Klal Yisrael. For Baruch Hashem should send Yeshua's first parnasset should do him to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the Biaskel Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.